A single sentence buried inside a California law almost forced every Linux distribution on Earth to start asking for your birth date before you could even use your own computer. Nobody in Sacramento seemed to think that through when they wrote it. And when the open source world finally noticed what had actually been signed into law, the backlash that followed didn't just embarrass the lawmaker responsible. It forced her to publicly reverse her own bill within months, in front of the entire tech industry watching. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because this story sounds like a small policy footnote on the surface, but underneath it is a genuinely wild case study in what happens when the government tries to regulate something it fundamentally doesn't understand. And by the end, you'll see exactly why so many people are calling this one of the strangest legislative retreats in recent tech history. What makes this story worth telling isn't just the political drama, though there's plenty of that here. It's the fact that a handful of unpaid volunteers, working through mailing lists and forum threads, managed to outmaneuver an entire state legislature on a piece of technology they clearly understood far better than the people writing laws about it. That almost never happens in modern policy fights, where corporate lobbyists with massive budgets usually decide how these stories end. This time, the outcome looked completely different, and it's worth understanding exactly how that happened. Let's rewind to where this actually started. In late 2025, California passed Assembly Bill 1043, officially known as the Digital Age Assurance Act. The core idea behind the law sounded reasonable enough on paper. Instead of forcing every individual app and website to verify a user's age separately, the law shifted that responsibility up to the operating system level itself. Under the original text, any operating system distributed in California would be required to ask users for their birth date or age bracket during initial device setup, then expose that information as an age signal to apps and app stores whenever needed. The law defined specific age brackets under 13, 13 to 15, 16 to 17, and 18 and up. The stated goal was protecting minors from age-restricted content and services without putting the burden entirely on individual companies to build their own verification systems from scratch. For a platform like Apple's iOS or Google's Android, this kind of requirement, while still controversial from a privacy standpoint, at least made some structural sense. Those are centralized. Commercially controlled systems with accounts, app stores, and a single company responsible for compliance. Linux is not that. Linux was never built to be that. That's exactly where this entire story starts to unravel for California lawmakers. Most Linux distributions, things like Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch Linux, and Linux Mint, are community-run projects maintained largely by volunteers. There's no central corporate account system. There's often no user account infrastructure at all in the way commercial operating systems have it. No telemetry pipeline collecting data back to a single company. No formal ownership structure that a lawsuit could even meaningfully target. When California's law said every operating system provider must verify age during setup, it never seemed to account for the fact that huge swaths of the operating system world simply don't have a provider in the corporate sense the law was clearly imagining. Think about how Linux actually gets distributed in the real world. You can download an ISO file from a mirror server anywhere on Earth. You can fork the entire project, modify the source code, rename it, and redistribute your own version to anyone who wants it, completely legally. Because that's literally the point of open source licensing. There's no single company standing behind Ubuntu the way Apple stands behind iOS. The Ubuntu project is stewarded by Canonical, sure, but anyone can take that code and build something else from it entirely, with no obligation to ask permission first. So when this law effectively said every operating system needs to verify a user's age at setup, open source developers immediately asked the obvious question. Verify it how, exactly, and enforced by whom? A hobbyist maintaining a small Linux distribution in their spare time isn't equipped to become a legal compliance department overnight. And if they don't comply, who exactly gets sued? The package maintainer who patched a security bug? The volunteer who wrote documentation? The person who fixed a memory leak in the kernel? Nobody in Sacramento seemed to have a clear answer because nobody writing the bill appeared to have deeply considered how decentralized, forkable software actually works in practice. The penalties attached to noncompliance made this even more alarming for the people potentially on the hook. Reports on similar legislation moving through other states cited civil fines, reaching $2,500 for unintentional violations and $7,500 for intentional ones. Picture that number sitting over the head of someone who maintains a niche Linux distribution purely as a hobby project, uploading updates from their bedroom on weekends with no legal team, no compliance department, and often no revenue at all tied to the project. A single fine at that level could realistically bankrupt or end a project some volunteer has poured years of unpaid effort into building for the community. Some legal experts raised an even deeper structural conflict buried inside this entire situation. Many open source licenses, including the widely used GPL, explicitly state that distributors cannot impose further restrictions on the rights granted to people receiving the software. If a state law forces a distribution to bolt on mandatory age verification just to remain legally distributable, that requirement could arguably conflict directly with the licensing terms the software was released under in the first place. That's not a minor technicality. It's a genuine legal contradiction between state law and decades-old open-source licensing philosophy, one that nobody drafting the original bill appears to have anticipated or addressed. Developers openly discussed several uncomfortable options in response, according to reporting at the time. Some talked about simply ignoring the law until actively forced to comply through some kind of enforcement action. Others floated the idea of moving projects entirely to jurisdictions with friendlier digital policy environments, effectively taking pieces of the open source ecosystem and relocating them outside California's reach. A few even suggested individual maintainers might start blocking traffic from California IP addresses to their repositories entirely, a defensive move that would have ironically hurt exactly the population of everyday Californian users the original law claimed to be protecting. The backlash didn't take long to build once developers actually understood what the bill meant for them. Privacy advocates, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation, criticized the legislation as invasive, warning it could quietly build the infrastructure for much broader identity tracking across the internet. Once operating systems start collecting age brackets by law, the concern goes that data pipeline doesn't stay limited to protecting children for long. It becomes a foundation that future laws can build on top of, eventually, pushing toward name-linked accounts or persistent identity verification tied to every device you own. Linux developers raised a more practical, almost absurd concern too. How exactly does a state government enforce an age verification requirement on software that can be infinitely copied, modified, and redistributed by literally anyone, anywhere, with zero central authority to hold accountable? You can't regulate a piece of software the same way you regulate a company, because there often isn't a company at the other end of a Linux distribution at all. Even Governor Newsom's own signing statement, when he originally signed the bill into law, quietly acknowledged some of these problems. He specifically flagged concerns about multi-user accounts shared within families and user profiles used across multiple devices, hinting that the implementation details hadn't been fully worked out even at the moment of signing. That's a fairly unusual thing for a governor to admit in the same breath as signing something into law, and it set the stage for exactly the kind of amendment fight that followed months later. If you're the kind of person who wants to actually understand how tech policy collides with reality instead of just reading outrage headlines about it, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because the next part of this story gets genuinely entertaining. Development communities didn't just complain online and hope someone in government would notice. They started actively working through what compliance would even technically look like, almost as a form of protest by demonstration. Ubuntu developer Aaron Rainbolt proposed a technical framework on the Ubuntu mailing list, an optional interface that individual applications could choose to use if a distribution decided to implement one. Over at the Fedora project leader Jeff Spaleta suggested an even simpler workaround, essentially extending existing account management systems to store an age value in a configuration file, letting applications check that file if they cared to. He even noted that the whole system could function on a basic honor system since nothing in the law specified how strong the verification actually needed to be. That detail alone tells you a lot about how seriously the technical requirements had actually been thought through by lawmakers. If a simple drop-down menu asking your age counts as legal compliance, the entire framework starts to look less like meaningful child protection and more like a box-checking exercise that happened to land on an ecosystem completely unequipped to check it. Then things got genuinely creative. A developer named John McCardle built an entire Linux distribution called Ageless Linux in March of 2026, explicitly as a protest project. The distribution tracked how other Linux projects responded to the age verification mandate and published tools specifically designed to strip out any compliance mechanisms distributions added. The deeper point behind the project was almost darkly funny. It demonstrated that a simple script changing a single name string in the operating system could legally shift thousands of dollars in potential non-compliance penalties onto some random hobbyist developer who never asked to be part of any of this. It exposed just how flimsy the entire enforcement framework really was the moment you applied it to genuinely open, forkable software. Think about what that actually demonstrates in practical terms. If changing a text string in a configuration file is enough to legally transform a compliant operating system into a non-compliant one, and vice versa, the entire premise of the law as a meaningful child safety measure starts to collapse under its own logic. A determined teenager could theoretically download Ageless Linux or simply rename their own distribution's identifying string and technically sidestep the entire framework in minutes. That's not a hypothetical edge case dreamed up by critics looking for reasons to complain. It was a working demonstration. built and published specifically to prove the point beyond any doubt. Meanwhile, the technical debate happening inside major distribution projects revealed just how seriously developers were actually taking this, even while mocking the law's impracticality in public forums. Systemed developers, the team responsible for one of the most foundational pieces of infrastructure running underneath most modern Linux distributions, actually merged code supporting the storage of a user's birth date, specifically for age verification purposes. This wasn't a joke or a protest gesture. It was a genuine technical response, driven by the fact that the XDG desktop portal project, another widely used piece of Linux infrastructure, was independently adding an age verification portal that needed some kind of underlying data source to actually function. That detail matters more than it might seem at first glance. It shows that even while public criticism of the law was intense and often mocking, serious infrastructure-level engineering work was quietly happening in parallel, because responsible maintainers understood that ignoring the law entirely wasn't necessarily a safe long-term strategy either. Distributions like Debian took a similarly careful approach, with the Debian project publicly investigating whether the new wave of age verification laws even applied to their distribution at all, while trying to keep any resulting features strictly optional rather than baked in as a mandatory requirement for every single user, regardless of jurisdiction. Even outside the traditional Linux world, the ripple effects reached further than most people expected. Midnight BSD, a BSD-based operating system built on different underlying code than Linux entirely, released a version specifically including a new age attestation background service, one designed to run automatically at startup unless a user or administrator manually disabled it through a configuration file. That detail alone shows how far this legislative ripple spread, touching operating systems well outside the traditional Linux distribution family entirely, simply because the underlying legal question of what counts as an operating system provider ended up being broad enough to catch nearly anything capable of running software. Meanwhile, Valve's SteamOS became a fascinating edge case in this entire debate, precisely because it doesn't fit neatly into either category. SteamOS is technically Linux-based, but it ships bundled with Valve's proprietary Steam storefront and client software, a commercial app ecosystem that looks a lot more like Apple's App Store or Google Play than a typical community Linux distribution. That similarity to a centralized commercial platform meant SteamOS could potentially remain subject to California's age verification requirements, even if pure community distributions like Debian or Arch eventually got exempted. It's a small detail, but it perfectly illustrates just how messy the line between open source and commercial software actually gets once lawmakers try to draw a hard boundary through it. Think about the practical weirdness that edge case actually creates. If SteamOS remains covered under the law while the underlying Linux kernel and base system it's built on top of gets exempted, you end up with a strange legal situation where the exact same lines of open source code are treated completely differently depending on which company happens to be bundling proprietary software. On top of them, Valve didn't write the Linux kernel, but by shipping their own storefront alongside it, they may have inadvertently pulled their entire platform back under a regulatory framework. The base operating system underneath it was specifically designed to escape. That's the kind of contradiction that tends to keep lawyers employed for years, sorting out exactly where one legal category ends and another begins. The pressure kept building through early 2026, and it wasn't just an online forum phenomenon anymore. System 76, a company that builds Linux-based laptops and desktops, got directly involved in a similar fight playing out simultaneously in Colorado, where a comparable age attestation bill was working its way through that state's legislature. System 76's CEO, Carl Richel, met directly with Colorado State Senator Matt Ball, who co-authored that state's version of the bill, and the senator himself suggested excluding open source software from the requirements entirely. That meeting, happening in parallel with the California controversy, signaled something important. This wasn't just internet outrage that politicians could quietly ignore. It was becoming a recognized structural problem that multiple state legislatures were independently discovering they needed to fix. Rochelle's own account of a follow-up meeting is worth understanding in more detail, because it shows exactly how this kind of advocacy actually works behind closed doors. He described how everyone who participated in an earlier meeting submitted their own proposed changes to the Colorado bill, offering ideas meant to genuinely improve consumer protection and privacy while still carving out an exemption for open source software specifically. The senator's office responded positively, agreeing to begin drafting potential amendments based on that direct industry and community feedback. That's a meaningfully different dynamic than simply shouting into the void on social media and hoping someone important happens to notice. It was a structured, good faith conversation between a company representing the open source hardware community and the actual legislator responsible for writing the bill. If this kind of policy mess is entertaining to watch unfold, drop a like on this video because the resolution to this story is, honestly, one of the more satisfying examples of tech advocacy actually working that we've seen in years. Here's where the story reaches its real turning point. Assembly member Buffy Wicks, the same lawmaker who originally authored the Digital Age Assurance Act, introduced a new amendment bill, Assembly Bill 1856, on February 11th of 2026. In a fairly remarkable moment of legislative self-correction, later revisions of her own amendment began, including language specifically designed to exempt most open-source operating systems from the very law she had written just months earlier. Watching the actual bill move through the legislative process reveals just how contested this correction was, even after Wicks herself proposed it. As of April 20th of 2026, the bill reportedly had only 2 organizations formally supporting it, against 3 organizations formally opposing it. That's a striking split for a bill that, on its face, was simply trying to fix an obvious oversight. It tells you that even the fix itself became a battleground, with some privacy advocates worried the amendment didn't go far enough, and others concerned it created new loopholes commercial platforms might eventually try to exploit. The bill continued moving through California's legislative process during the months that followed. By mid-May of 2026, the latest version of the amendment was dated May 18th, and the following day, on May 19th, the bill was read a second time and formally ordered to a third reading, standard procedural steps on the path toward final passage. It still needed to clear committee reviews, scheduled for June, and pass through. Both chambers of the state legislature before Governor Newsom could potentially sign it into law, meaning the fight, while trending in the open source community's favor, wasn't entirely finished, even as of the most recent updates available. The amendment's language redefined what actually counts as an operating system provider under California law, specifically excluding any entity that distributes software under a license permitting users to copy, redistribute, or modify it. Read that carefully, because that's essentially the textbook legal definition of open source software itself. In practice, that redefinition would exempt the overwhelming majority of mainstream Linux distributions, Debian, Fedora, Ubuntu, Arch Linux, and Mint among them, from the compliance requirements originally scheduled to take effect on January 1st of 2027. To be clear about what this amendment does and doesn't do, it does not repeal the original Digital Age Assurance Act. Commercial platforms with proprietary app ecosystems, think Windows, macOS, iOS, and Android, remain fully subject to the law's requirements. What changed is narrowly, specifically the definition of who counts as a covered operating system provider in the first place, carving out community-driven, forkable, license-based software from a framework that was clearly designed with centralized commercial platforms in mind from the start. There's an interesting technical wrinkle buried inside the amendment worth understanding too. The new language clarifies that an operating system provider's obligation only applies when there's an actual account, configuration function built into the setup process for using the system on a specific device. That distinction matters enormously because most Linux distributions simply don't have centralized accounts, mandatory telemetry systems, or controlled app stores tying a device back to a single company's infrastructure. There's no single entity controlling the end-to-end experience the way Apple or Google does with their platforms, which is precisely the structural gap the original bill never seemed to account for. That technical distinction does leave some genuinely interesting gray areas, though, particularly for enterprise Linux distributions built around commercial subscription models. Red Hat. Enterprise Linux, for example, operates through a formal subscription system that looks a lot closer to a traditional commercial relationship than a typical community distribution does. Whether that subscription model could trigger the account configuration clause is something that would likely require formal legal interpretation to settle definitively. For most system administrators running distributions like Rocky Linux or Alma Linux inside California-based data centers, the practical risk of falling under the law appears low based on current amendment language, but organizations running formal Red Hat subscriptions may reasonably want legal guidance before the law's January 2027 effective date arrives, just to be safe. The amendment also expanded the law in another direction simultaneously, applying similar requirements to browser providers, website operators, while requiring operating system vendors to transmit only the minimum amount of information necessary to comply. Wicks herself stated publicly that she wanted to ensure every online space children could access, including websites, remained covered under some form of age assurance framework, even while carving Linux out of the specific operating system requirement that had caused all the uproar in the first place. Now, here's the part of this story that deserves real scrutiny, because not everyone in the open source and privacy communities treated this as an unambiguous win. Critics on forums like Slashdot pushed back hard, arguing that carve-outs like this one are almost always temporary, and warning that accepting an exemption now doesn't guarantee it survives future legislative sessions. Some pointed out something sharper still, that this entire age verification push likely has less to do with protecting children and more to do with large media and social platforms, trying to shift legal liability for addictive engagement design onto operating systems and browsers instead of taking responsibility themselves. That's a genuinely fair point worth sitting with. Companies like Meta, TikTok, and YouTube have faced mounting criticism and lawsuits over how their platforms are designed to maximize engagement, particularly among younger users. Pushing age verification obligations down to the operating system level conveniently distributes legal responsibility across an entire technology stack, rather than concentrating scrutiny on the platforms actually designing the addictive features in the first place. Whether that was the deliberate intent behind California's original law, or simply an unintended structural side effect, is something reasonable people can disagree about, but the effect is functionally similar either way. Other critics raised a completely different objection, one rooted less in corporate liability shifting and more in basic parental responsibility. Several commenters argued that responsibility for monitoring what children access online should fall primarily on parents, rather than being encoded into mandatory operating system behavior enforced by state law. The argument goes something like this: parents don't let young children walk home alone from school unsupervised. So why would the same parents allow unrestricted, unsupervised access to the entire internet through a personal device? Critics making this argument suggested that OS-level age verification quietly shifts responsibility away from families and toward government-mandated technical infrastructure, treating a parenting and household decision as something requiring a statewide regulatory solution instead. A more pointed version of this criticism went even further, suggesting that framing this legislation purely around child protection understates its broader implications. Some privacy advocates argued the underlying goal, whether stated explicitly or not, has more to do with establishing identity verification requirements for internet access generally, using child safety as the politically palatable justification for infrastructure that could eventually be used to reduce anonymous participation online across the board. That's a more speculative claim than the liability shifting argument, and it's worth treating with appropriate skepticism, but it reflects a genuine strand of concern running through the broader privacy community reacting to this entire category of legislation, not just California's specific bill. There's also a broader concern that outlasts this specific bill entirely. Once the legal and technical infrastructure for OS-level age verification exists anywhere, even with Linux exempted, that framework doesn't just disappear from the conversation. Privacy advocates warn that what starts as a simple age bracket signal today can quietly become the foundation for far more invasive identity. Verification requirements tomorrow, name-linked accounts, biometric verification, or persistent tracking tied directly to specific devices rather than isolated apps. Carving Linux out of one specific bill doesn't necessarily protect the broader principle that operating systems shouldn't be turned into government-mandated identity checkpoints in the first place. Still, from a pure advocacy and organizing standpoint, what happened here is genuinely remarkable, and it's worth appreciating on its own terms. A relatively small, distributed community of developers, many of them unpaid volunteers with no formal lobbying budget, no corporate PR department, and no unified leadership structure, managed to identify a fundamental flaw in a piece of state legislation, organize a coherent public response across mailing lists and forums, and ultimately convince the exact same lawmaker who wrote the original bill to introduce a correcting amendment specifically addressing their concerns. That's not a small thing in the world of legislative advocacy, where corporate lobbyists with massive budgets typically dominate the conversation entirely. It also says something important about how governments consistently underestimate open source software when writing technology policy. Lawmakers are used to regulating companies, entities with headquarters, legal departments, shareholders, and clear lines of accountability they can point enforcement actions toward. Open source software breaks that entire mental model completely. There's often no company to fine, no single decision maker to summon for testimony, and no practical way to force compliance onto a project that can be forked into an entirely new, functionally identical version within hours of any enforcement action being announced. California's Digital Age Assurance Act ran headfirst into that exact structural mismatch, and the backlash that followed was really just the technical community explaining, loudly and repeatedly, why the law simply couldn't work the way it was originally written. This pattern isn't actually unique to age verification either, and it's worth zooming out for a moment to see the bigger recurring theme. Governments have run into remarkably similar walls before when trying to regulate encryption software. cryptocurrency protocols, and peer-to-peer file sharing networks, all technologies built around the same basic principle of decentralization that makes traditional corporate-style regulation fundamentally difficult to apply cleanly. Each time, lawmakers eventually had to learn, sometimes painfully and publicly, that a law written with a single accountable company in mind simply doesn't translate cleanly onto software with no single company behind it at all. California's age verification fight is just the newest, most visible chapter in that same long-running story. Watch what happens next in Colorado too, because that state appears to be heading down a nearly identical path, just a step or two behind California's timeline. Colorado's own age attestation bill, sometimes referenced as SB 26-51, has reportedly been moving toward a similar open source exemption, following direct engagement between System 76's CEO and the state senator who co-authored that bill. If this pattern continues, and there's a reasonable case it will, we may be watching the early formation of a broader, informal precedent across multiple states, one where lawmakers increasingly recognize up front that open source operating systems simply don't fit inside frameworks built around centralized commercial platforms and start writing that distinction into bills from the beginning. Instead of learning it the hard way after public backlash forces a correction, there's a genuine opportunity buried inside this pattern for the open source community moving forward, one worth calling out directly. Every time this exact scenario plays out in a new state, from the initial oversight to public backlash to eventual legislative correction, it builds a stronger case history that future lawmakers or their legislative staff can reference before a bill ever gets introduced in the first place. Advocacy groups and organizations like the Linux Foundation could reasonably use California's experience as a template, proactively reaching out to legislators in other states considering similar age verification frameworks, potentially preventing this entire cycle of oversight and correction from repeating itself over and over, state by state, for years to come. That's really the deeper lesson sitting underneath this entire episode. Governments are going to keep trying to regulate technology, and plenty of that regulation is going to keep colliding with how open source software actually works in practice. Because most lawmakers simply don't spend their days thinking about how a forkable license-based, volunteer-maintained piece of software fundamentally differs from a product built and controlled by a single corporation. What changed this specific outcome wasn't some overwhelming corporate lobbying campaign. It was a loud, technically informed, persistent public response from the exact community the law would have affected most directly. And that response was compelling enough to make the bill's own original author walk part of it back in public. So the next time you see a headline claiming some new law is about to break the entire way open source software works, remember this story. Sometimes those laws really do get written without anyone involved fully understanding the ecosystem they're about to regulate. And sometimes, if enough of the right people notice in time and speak up clearly enough, that mistake actually gets fixed before it ever takes effect, which is precisely what happened here, months before California's Digital Age Assurance Act was ever scheduled to take hold in January of 2027. Before you go, if you want to keep following stories where technology policy and the open source world collide in ways nobody in government expected, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this coming as more states start writing similar bills of their own. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.